Imagine a world where the map of the globe looks nothing like it does today. A world where empires that fell stayed standing and revolutions that changed the face of democracy never happened. Now, imagine that the only thing standing between our world and that alternate reality was a single unlocked door, a misplaced scrap of paper, or a soldier deciding to take a nap at the wrong time. History is often taught as a series of inevitable triumphs and tragedies, but that is a lie. History is a fragile glass sculpture, and more than once, someone has nearly dropped it because their hands were slippery. We are going to dive into the moments where the smallest human errors triggered a domino effect that crashed through centuries. These aren't just mistakes, they are the oops moments that redefined humanity. The year was 1862. The American Civil War was at a bloody stalemate. General Robert E. Lee, the tactical mastermind of the Confederacy, had launched a daring invasion of the North. His plan was brilliant, complex, and, if successful, would likely have forced the Union to surrender, leading to a permanent fracture of the United States. Lee's Special Order 191 detailed the exact movements of his entire army, split into wings that were vulnerable if caught alone. It was a roadmap to a Confederate victory. But history didn't hinge on Lee's brilliance. It hinged on a careless staff officer with a craving for a smoke. As the Confederate troops moved out of their camp near Frederick, Maryland, a copy of Special Order 191 was somehow dropped in a field. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was wrapped around 3 cigars. A few hours later, Union Sergeant John Bloss and Corporal Barton Mitchell of the 27th Indiana Volunteer Infantry sat down in that same field to rest. Mitchell spotted a bulky envelope in the grass. He didn't find gold or ammunition. He found 3 cigars and a document that changed the world. The soldiers realized the gravity of the find immediately. The lost order was rushed up the chain of command to Union General George McClellan. When McClellan read it, he reportedly exclaimed, "Here is a paper with which, if I cannot whip Bobby Lee, I will be willing to go home." For the first time in the war, the Union knew exactly where every piece of the Confederate puzzle was located. This intelligence led directly to the Battle of Antietam, the bloodiest single day in American history. Because McClellan knew Lee's plans, he was able to check the Confederate advance. While the battle was technically a draw, it was the strategic victory President Abraham Lincoln desperately needed. Why was it so pivotal? Before Antietam, Great Britain and France were on the verge of officially recognizing the Confederacy as a sovereign nation and providing them with military aid. After the Confederate retreat, Lincoln felt confident enough to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. This shifted the purpose of the war from preserving the Union to ending slavery. Once the war became a crusade against slavery, it became politically impossible for European powers to intervene on the side of the South. If those 3 cigars hadn't been dropped, or if Mitchell had simply walked 5 feet to the left, Lee might have marched into Washington, D.C. unopposed. The United States would have been 2 separate warring nations. Slavery might have persisted for decades longer. The global superpower we know today would never have existed. All because a tired officer didn't check his pockets before he broke camp. History wasn't written in blood that day. It was written on a lost scrap of paper found in the dirt of a Maryland clover field. For our next stop, we move from the blood-soaked fields of Maryland to the freezing waters of the North Atlantic. It is April 1912. The RMS Titanic, the largest and most luxurious ship ever built, is on its maiden voyage. It was touted as unsinkable, a marvel of Edwardian engineering that supposedly defied the laws of nature. But the disaster that claimed over 1,500 lives didn't happen because of a lack of steel or a failure of the engines. It happened because of a tiny silver key that was sitting in a sailor's pocket on dry land. The story begins with a last-minute crew reshuffle. Just before the Titanic set sail from Southampton, England, the White Star Line's parent company, the White Star Line, decided to replace the ship's second officer, David Blair, with a more experienced officer from a sister ship.
In the rush to pack his bags and leave the vessel, Blair forgot one crucial thing. He had the key to the ship's lookout crow's nest locker in his pocket. Inside that locked cabinet were the ship's high-power binoculars. Because Blair had the key, the lookouts on duty, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, were forced to rely on nothing but their naked eyes to scan the horizon. On a clear night, that might be enough, but the night of April 14th was eerily calm, with no wind and no waves breaking at the base of icebergs to create white foam. The flat, calm sea made icebergs nearly invisible until you were right on top of them. Without binoculars, the lookouts couldn't see the black berg until it was less than 500 yards away. Frederick Fleet rang the warning bell 3 times and telephoned the bridge, shouting the famous words, "Iceberg right ahead!" But then it was too late. The Titanic was moving at 22 knots. Even with the engines reversed, the massive ship needed miles to stop. It struck the ice 37 seconds later. Later, during the official inquiry into the sinking, Fleet was asked if binoculars would have helped. He testified with haunting certainty that if they had possessed them, they would have seen the ice enough in advance to steer clear. A few more seconds of warning would have allowed the ship to turn fully, avoiding the fatal side swipe that opened 5 of its watertight compartments to the sea. The ripple effect of this mistake was staggering. The sinking of the Titanic led to a total overhaul of maritime safety laws, including the requirement for enough lifeboats for everyone on board and 24-hour radio watches. But more than that, it shattered the Victorian-era belief that technology had conquered nature. The arrogance of an entire generation died in those icy waters, all because an officer left for home with a small locker key still tucked in his coat. One man's forgetfulness became a tragedy that has fascinated the world for over a century. A simple turn of a key could have kept the Titanic afloat, and thousands of families would have been spared a watery grave.
If the sinking of the Titanic was a tragedy born of a forgotten key, our next story is a catastrophe born of a bad GPS. Well, the 1914 version of one. This is the story of how a single wrong turn by a confused driver didn't just end a life, it ended an era, collapsed 4 empires, and claimed the lives of 20 million people. It was June 28, 1914, in Sarajevo. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was visiting the city to inspect imperial troops. Waiting for him in the shadows were 6 assassins, members of a group called the Black Hand, armed with bombs and pistols. They wanted independence for the South Slavs, and they saw the Archduke's blood as the price of admission. The day started with a failure. One assassin threw a bomb at the Archduke's car, but it bounced off the folded roof and exploded under the car behind him, injuring several officers. Ferdinand, remarkably cool-headed, continued to a scheduled reception at the town hall. However, after the event, he insisted on changing his plans. Instead of heading to the museum as intended, he wanted to visit the hospital to see the men wounded by the morning's bomb. This change in plans was the first domino. The second was a failure in communication. The Archduke's driver, Leopold Loika, was not properly briefed on the new route. As the motorcade sped through the streets, Loika followed the original path and turned onto Franz Joseph Street. General Podioreck, who was riding with the Archduke, noticed the mistake and shouted, "What is this? This is the wrong way. We're supposed to go by the Appelquay." Loika slammed on the brakes to shift into reverse. The engine died. The heavy vehicle came to a dead stop directly in front of a deli called Schiller's. By a coincidence so chilling it feels like a movie script, one of the assassins, Gavrilo Princip, was standing right there. After the failure of the morning's bombing, Princip had wandered over to the deli to buy a sandwich, assuming the mission had failed and the Archduke was long gone. Suddenly he looked up and saw his target, stalled, silent, and sitting like a duck just 5 feet away. Princip didn't hesitate. He pulled his pistol and fired 2 shots. One hit the Archduke in the neck, the other hit his wife, Sophie, in the abdomen. Within minutes, both were dead.
Had Loika turned the steering wheel a few inches less, or had the engine not stalled at that exact second, Princep would have finished his sandwich and gone home. Instead, those 2 bullets triggered a blank check of military alliances. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia mobilized to protect Serbia. Germany backed Austria. France and Britain joined to stop Germany. Within weeks, the globe was engulfed in World War I. This war to end all wars led directly to the rise of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the German economy, and the eventual rise of Adolf Hitler, sparking World War II. Our modern world, its borders, its conflicts, and its technology was forged in the fires of a global conflict that started because a driver missed a turn and his engine gave out in front of the wrong sandwich shop. For our 4th story, we travel back to the year 1453. The setting is Constantinople, the city of the world's desire. For over 1,000 years, this fortress city had stood as the unbreakable capital of the Byzantine Empire, the last remnant of the ancient Roman world. Its walls, the legendary Theodosian walls, were the most sophisticated defense system in human history. They had survived countless sieges from Huns, Arabs, and Crusaders. But the Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II, was determined to succeed where everyone else had failed. He arrived with an army of 80,000 men and the Dardanelles gun, a gun so massive it could fire 1,200-pound stone balls. For weeks, the walls were battered, yet the defenders held. Constantinople was a city built on the idea that it could never be taken by force, and it might have stayed that way if not for a single small door called the Kirkaporta. The Kirkaporta was a minor postern gate, a small entrance used by pedestrians and messengers. During the height of the final chaotic Ottoman assault, the defenders were so focused on the main gates and the crumbling sections of the wall that someone committed a fatal, mundane oversight. They forgot to bolt the Kirkaporta. A small group of Ottoman janissaries, scavenging for a weak point along the perimeter, noticed the door was slightly ajar. At first, they thought it was a trap. They hesitated, waiting for an ambush that never came. Realizing the path was clear, a handful of soldiers slipped through the gate and climbed to the top of the inner wall. From that vantage point, they raised the Ottoman flag. The sight of the enemy flag flying over the impregnable walls sent a shockwave of pure panic through the Byzantine defenders. The cry went up, "The city is taken! The city has fallen!" The psychological blow was more devastating than any cannonball. The Byzantine defense collapsed in minutes as soldiers abandoned their posts to save their families. The emperor, Constantine XI, reportedly tore off his imperial regalia and charged into the fray, never to be seen again. By midday, Constantinople, the gateway between East and West, belonged to the Ottomans. The consequences of this unlocked door changed the DNA of our world. The fall of Constantinople blocked the traditional Silk Road trade routes to Asia. This forced European powers like Spain and Portugal to find new ways to reach the East. It was this desperate search for a sea route that led Ferdinand Magellan and Christopher Columbus to set sail across the Atlantic. In a very literal sense, the European discovery of the Americas happened because someone forgot to lock a door in Turkey. Furthermore, the flight of Greek scholars from the falling city to Italy, carrying ancient Roman and Greek texts, provided the intellectual spark that ignited the Renaissance. The modern Western world, our science, our art, and the very existence of the United States can be traced back to a sleepy guard who left a latch undone on a Tuesday morning in May.
For this chapter, we step away from the battlefield and into the quiet, messy laboratory of a Scottish scientist in 1928. This is perhaps the greatest mistake in the history of science, a blunder that has saved an estimated 200 million lives. Before this moment, a simple scratch from a rose thorn or a bout of strep throat was often a death sentence. Alexander Fleming was a brilliant researcher, but he was notoriously untidy.
His lab at St. Mary's Hospital in London was a cluttered forest of glass tubes and petri dishes. In August 1928, Fleming decided to take a much-needed vacation with his family. However, in his rush to leave, he didn't properly clean his workspace. He left a stack of Staphylococci culture plates, deadly bacteria, sitting out on a bench instead of placing them in an incubator or a refrigerator. While he was away, a series of coincidences occurred. First, the temperature in London dropped significantly, which allowed a specific type of rare mold to grow. Then, the temperature rose, which allowed the bacteria on the plates to flourish. When Fleming returned from his holiday on September 3rd, he began sorting through his neglected plates. Most were ruined by common mold. He was about to toss them into a vat of disinfectant when he noticed something strange on one particular dish. A blob of mold, Penicillium notatum, had grown, but in the area immediately surrounding the mold, the deadly staph bacteria had completely vanished. It was a ghost zone, where the bacteria had been dissolved. Fleming famously remarked, "That's funny." If Fleming had been a more disciplined, cleaner scientist, he would have bleached those plates before leaving. If he had been less observant, he would have thrown the contaminated dish away without a second thought. Instead, his messiness led to the discovery of the world's first antibiotic. But the story doesn't end there. It took over a decade for other scientists, Florey and Chain, to figure out how to mass-produce this mold juice. It arrived just in time for World War II. Before penicillin, more soldiers died from infected wounds than from actual combat. Penicillin changed that, keeping thousands of Allied soldiers alive and capable of staying in the fight. Today, we take antibiotics for granted. We pop a pill and expect our infections to disappear. But we owe our modern life expectancy, which jumped by nearly 20 years following this discovery, to a scientist who forgot to wash his dishes before going on vacation. It was a failure of hygiene that became the ultimate victory for medicine. We move now to the high-stakes tension of the Cold War. For nearly 30 years, the Berlin Wall stood as the ultimate symbol of oppression, a concrete scar through the heart of Europe that separated families and ideologies. It was meant to last for 100 years, according to East German leaders, but it didn't fall because of a grand revolution or a military invasion. It fell because a mid-level bureaucrat didn't have time to read his notes. It was November 9th, 1989. The East German government was under immense pressure from protests, and they decided to relax travel restrictions slightly to appease the public. They drafted a document stating that East Germans could apply for visas to travel to the West, but only through a formal process that would take days or weeks to approve. The task of announcing this new policy was given to Günter Schabowski, a government spokesperson. Just before he walked out for a live, internationally televised press conference, he was handed a piece of paper containing the new regulations. He hadn't been present for the meetings where the details were finalized, and he hadn't read the briefing notes. During the press conference, an Italian journalist asked when the new travel rules would come into effect. Schabowski fumbled with his papers, looking confused. He saw a line that said, "immediately," referring to the processing of applications, not the actual travel. He looked up at the cameras and said, "As far as I know, it takes effect immediately, without delay." The news spread like wildfire. Thousands of East Berliners rushed to the border checkpoints, demanding to be let through. The border guards, who had received no new orders, were stunned. They called their superiors, but no one knew what to do. The crowd grew into a massive, peaceful wave of humanity. One specific guard at the Bornhammer Street crossing, Harold Jaeger, faced a choice: open fire on his own people or open the gate. Overwhelmed and confused by Schabowski's blunder, he chose to open the gate. Once one gate opened, they all did. By midnight, people were dancing on top of the wall, chipping away at the concrete with hammers and chisels. The Berlin Wall was gone by morning. The Iron Curtain collapsed shortly after, leading to the reunification of Germany and the eventual fall of the Soviet Union. The Cold War ended not with a nuclear blast, but with a tired man misreading a memo. If Schabowski had simply read his notes, or if the journalist hadn't asked that specific question, the wall might have stood for another decade, and the map of Europe would look very different today. While most historical blunders take place on the ground, some travel much further. In 1999, NASA faced one of its most embarrassing and expensive failures, not because of a lack of genius, but because of a simple lack of communication regarding units of measurement. This is the story of the Mars Climate Orbiter, a $125 million spacecraft that turned into a shooting star because of a math error a middle schooler is taught to avoid. The mission was ambitious. The orbiter was designed to study the Martian atmosphere and act as a communications relay for future missions. It traveled for over 9 months, covering 416 million miles of empty space. On September 23, 1999, it finally reached the Red Planet. The engineers at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL, waited for the spacecraft to fire its engines and slip into a stable orbit. But instead of reappearing from behind the planet, the spacecraft remained silent. It was gone. The post-mortem investigation revealed a blunder that left the scientific community speechless. 2 different teams had been working on the software that controlled the orbiter's thrusters. The team at Lockheed Martin, which built the craft, used the English imperial system, pounds force. Meanwhile, the navigation team at NASA used the metric system, newtons. Every time the ground crew sent a command to adjust the ship's path, the software calculated the force in pounds, but the spacecraft's computer interpreted those numbers as newtons. Since 1 pound force is roughly equal to 4.45 newtons, the spacecraft was being pushed much harder than intended. Over the course of the 9-month journey, these tiny, unnoticed discrepancies added up. When the orbiter arrived at Mars, it was 60 miles lower than its intended altitude. Instead of skimming the top of the atmosphere, it plowed directly into it. The friction caused the delicate probe to either burn up instantly or skip off the atmosphere like a stone across a pond, tumbling forever into the dark void of deep space. In the aftermath, NASA's Associate Administrator for Space Science stated the problem here was not the error, it was the failure of NASA's systems to find the error. It was a humbling reminder that even in the age of supercomputers and space travel, the most advanced technology in the world is still at the mercy of a human failing to double-check their labels. This disaster changed how NASA operates. It led to the faster, better, cheaper philosophy being heavily scrutinized and forced an industry-wide standardization of the metric system. It proved that in the cold, unforgiving vacuum of space, there is no room for a foot when everyone else is using a meter. While we've seen how mistakes can end empires, this is the story of how a single administrative error helped create one. The United States of America. In 1777, the British Empire had a plan that should have crushed the American Rebellion once and for all. It was a pincer movement designed to cut the colonies in half. General John Burgoyne was to march south from Canada, while General William Howe was to march north from New York City. They were supposed to meet in Albany, New York, effectively isolating New England, the heart of the rebellion, from the rest of the colonies. On paper, it was foolproof. If it had worked, George Washington's army would have been strangled, and the United States would have remained a footnote in British history. But the plan didn't fail because of American military genius. It failed because a British lord wanted to go on vacation. Lord George Germain was the British Secretary of State for the colonies. He was the man responsible for coordinating the 2 generals. After approving Burgoyne's march from the north, he was supposed to send a formal, urgent letter to General Howe in New York, ordering him to move north to meet Burgoyne. However, as the story goes, Lord Germain was in a hurry to leave London for a weekend trip to his country estate. When he arrived at his office to sign the dispatch to Howe, he found that the letter hadn't been neatly fair copied, rewritten in a clean hand by his clerks. Rather than wait for the clerks to finish and risk missing his carriage, Germain simply left. He didn't sign the order, he didn't send the instructions. He figured he would just do it when he got back. The letter was tucked into a pigeonhole and forgotten for crucial days. By the time the orders finally reached Howe across the Atlantic, it was too late. Howe, having received no specific instructions to go north, decided instead to launch his own campaign to capture Philadelphia. Poor General Burgoyne marched his 7,000 men south, expecting to meet Howe's massive army. Instead, he found himself alone in the wilderness of New York, surrounded by thousands of emboldened American rebels. Without the reinforcements from the south, Burgoyne was forced to surrender at the Battle of Saratoga. The surrender at Saratoga was the turning point of the war. Before this, the French were hesitant to help the Americans, but when news reached Paris that an entire British army had surrendered, King Louis XVI finally agreed to a formal alliance. French money, ships, and soldiers began pouring into the colonies. Without that French support, the Americans almost certainly would have lost the war. The United States exists today because a British bureaucrat valued his weekend holiday more than double-checking his mail. A revolution succeeded, a monarchy eventually fell, and a new global power was born, all because a letter was left sitting in a desk drawer in London.
While we often think of mistakes as modern mishaps, one of the most devastating blunders in human history occurred in the mid-1300s. It wasn't a tactical military error or a missed letter. It was a mistake of biological curiosity and a failure of quarantine that allowed a silent killer to hitch a ride from the east to the west. This mistake led to the Black Death, a plague that wiped out nearly half of Europe's population. The story begins in the Crimean city of Kaffa, a bustling trading port. In 1347, the city was under siege by the Mongol Golden Horde. During the siege, a mysterious disease began to decimate the Mongol army. In a moment of early and horrific biological warfare, the Mongols began catapulting their plague-infested corpses over the city walls. The Genoese merchants inside Kaffa were terrified. They realized that staying in the city meant certain death. They scrambled to their ships, desperate to return to Italy. Here was the mistake. In their blind panic to escape, they didn't just bring their gold and their lives, they brought their stowaways. The merchants noticed that some of their sailors were falling ill with strange black swellings in their armpits and groins. Had they been disciplined, they would have burned the ships or stayed at sea. Instead, driven by the human instinct to get home, they sailed toward Sicily and the port of Messina. When the ships arrived in October 1347, the people of Messina met them at the docks. They saw a terrifying sight. Most of the sailors were dead, and the few who remained alive were covered in black sores and vomiting blood. The city authorities immediately ordered the death ships to leave the harbor. But it was too late. The mistake wasn't just letting the men off. It was failing to realize that the true killers weren't the humans. They were the black rats living in the cargo holds and the fleas living on those rats. During the short time the ships were docked, the rats scurried down the ropes and onto the piers. A single day of indecision by the port authorities allowed the plague to set foot in Europe. From Messina, it spread like a wildfire that couldn't be extinguished. It traveled through Italy, into France, across the English Channel, and deep into Russia. The consequences were world-altering. The massive loss of life caused the entire feudal system to collapse. Because there were so few laborers left, survivors could demand higher wages and more rights, effectively ending serfdom and paving the way for the modern economy. The church's power was shaken because priests were dying just as fast as peasants, leading people to question the divine order. The Renaissance, the rise of the middle class, and the shift toward modern medicine all grew out of the ashes of the plague.
All of this history was set in motion because a few terrified merchants couldn't stay away from home, and a port guard didn't think to cut the ropes of a plague-infested ship fast enough. One small failure of quarantine redrew the social and genetic map of the human race. History is often a series of almosts. Almost a peace treaty, almost a victory, almost a silence. In 1917, the German High Command made a calculated gamble that they thought would win them World War I. Instead, they committed a blunder that unleashed a political force that would dominate the 20th century and bring the world to the brink of nuclear annihilation. By the third year of World War I, Germany was exhausted, fighting a two-front war against France and Britain in the west and Russia in the east. They were desperate to knock Russia out of the fight. The German leaders knew that Russia was on the verge of internal collapse. The Tsar had abdicated, and the new provisional government was weak. But there was one man who could push Russia over the edge, a radical revolutionary named Vladimir Lenin, who was currently living in exile in Switzerland. The Germans came up with a brilliant plan. They would take Lenin, transport him across Germany in a private train, and inject him into Russia like a virus. They believed Lenin would start a second revolution, pull Russia out of the war, and allow Germany to move all its troops to the Western Front for one final victory. To ensure Lenin didn't spread his communist infection to German workers on the way, they put him in a single railway car and declared it extraterritorial. This became the famous sealed train. The mistake wasn't the train itself, it was the Germans' absolute arrogance. They believed they could use Lenin and then toss him aside. They assumed that once Russia was out of the war, Lenin's radical ideas would simply burn out or stay confined within Russian borders. They viewed him as a temporary tool of sabotage, not the architect of a new world order. When Lenin arrived at the Finland station in Petrograd, he didn't just cause a minor disturbance, he ignited the Bolshevik Revolution. Within months, the Russian Empire was dead, and the Soviet Union was born. Russia did indeed pull out of the war, but the German victory in the East came too late. The United States had entered the war, and Germany collapsed anyway. The German mistake was one of catastrophic short-sightedness. By sending that train, they didn't just win a temporary tactical advantage, they created the Soviet superpower. This led directly to the Cold War, the division of Europe, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the Cuban Missile Crisis. For 70 years, the entire planet lived under the shadow of a nuclear sword of Damocles, with two superpowers poised to destroy humanity. All of it, the gulags, the space race, the Berlin Wall, can be traced back to a group of German officers who thought they were being clever by giving a ride to a man in a sealed train. They wanted to win a war. Instead, they changed the political destiny of the planet forever.
While we often credit Christopher Columbus with the discovery of the New World in 1492, his journey was actually fueled by a series of monumental mathematical blunders. Columbus wasn't a man who set out to find a new continent. He was a man who set out to find India and failed miserably because he was terrible at geography. If he had known the actual size of the Earth, he likely would never have left the harbor. The mistake began with ancient maps and a misunderstanding of units. Columbus relied heavily on the calculations of Alfraganus, a 9th century Persian astronomer. Alfraganus had calculated the Earth's circumference with surprising accuracy, but he recorded the distance in Arabic miles. Columbus, reading these texts centuries later, assumed the measurements were in shorter Roman miles. This small unit conversion error made Columbus believe the Earth was 25% smaller than it actually is. But he didn't stop there. To make his pitch to the Spanish monarchs more appealing, Columbus stretched the size of the Asian continent eastward on his maps.
He also relied on the writings of Marco Polo to argue that the ocean between Europe and Japan was narrow and dotted with islands for easy resupply. By the time he was done adjusting the facts, Columbus had calculated that the distance from the Canary Islands to Japan was only about 2,400 miles. In reality, the distance is closer to 12,000 miles. When Columbus approached the King of Portugal for funding, the king's royal scholars laughed him out of the room. They knew the Earth was much larger and told him his math was delusional. They warned him that his crew would starve to death in the middle of a vast, empty ocean long before they ever smelled the spices of India. The Spanish monarchs, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, eventually agreed to fund him, not necessarily because they believed his math, but because they were desperate to beat Portugal to the spice trade. When Columbus finally spotted land after 5 weeks at sea, he was convinced he had reached the East Indies. He called the local inhabitants Indians, a mistake that persists in our language to this day. He went to his grave still believing he had found a shortcut to Asia, never fully realizing he had stumbled upon a massive landmass that wasn't on his map. This error changed the course of human history in ways that are still being felt. It led to the Spanish colonization of the Americas, the tragic collapse of the Aztec and Inca empires, the Atlantic slave trade, and the eventual rise of the United States. If Columbus had known the true distance, that the world was as big as the Portuguese claimed, no sailor in the 15th century would have boarded those ships. The discovery of the Americas would have happened much later, perhaps by a different nation, and the global language, religion, and power structure would be unrecognizable today. America was found not by a genius of navigation, but by a man who got his math wrong and got incredibly lucky that a continent was in the way. As we have seen, history is often decided by those who stay awake. In this chapter, we look at the birth of the Republic of Texas and the massive expansion of the United States, an event that was decided not by a superior military force, but by a siesta taken at the worst possible moment. The year was 1836. The Texas Revolution was at its breaking point. The Mexican army, led by the charismatic and iron-fisted general Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, had recently crushed the Texan defenders at the Alamo. Santa Anna was known as the Napoleon of the West, and he had every reason to be confident. He had a larger, better-trained army, and he had the rebel forces, led by Sam Houston, on the run. By April, the two armies faced each other near the San Jacinto River. Santa Anna's forces were superior in number, and he expected the Texans to stay on the defensive. On the morning of April 21st, Santa Anna received reinforcements, bringing his total strength to about 1,200 men. However, these new troops were exhausted from a long march. Instead of pressing his advantage or setting up a proper perimeter, Santa Anna made a fatal assumption. He believed the Texans were too intimidated to attack. Confident in his position, he ordered his entire army to stand down for a late afternoon siesta. No scouts were sent out, no sentries were posted on the front lines. The Mexican camp descended into a deep, quiet sleep under the hot Texas sun. Sam Houston, watching from the trees, couldn't believe his luck. At 3:30 p.m., while the Mexican officers and soldiers were dreaming, Houston gave the order. The Texan army of roughly 900 men swept across the open prairie in total silence until they were within 200 yards of the camp. Then the air was shattered by the cry, "Remember the Alamo!" The battle was over in just 18 minutes. It wasn't a fight, it was a rout. The Mexican soldiers woke up to find their camp overrun. Many were killed before they could even reach for their muskets. Santa Anna himself fled in the chaos, disappearing into the tall grass. He was captured the next day, hiding in a common soldier's uniform, recognized only when his own men accidentally saluted him as El Presidente. While prisoner, Santa Anna was forced to sign treaties that recognized Texas's independence and ordered all Mexican troops to withdraw. This mistake of the nap not just created the Republic of Texas. 9 years later, when Texas was annexed by the United States, it sparked the Mexican-American War. That conflict ended with the U.S. acquiring not just Texas, but California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and parts of New Mexico and Colorado. If Santa Anna had stayed awake or simply posted a few guards, the map of the North American continent would look drastically different today. Mexico might still stretch all the way to Northern California, and the USA would never have become a sea-to-shining-sea continental power. The entire geopolitical balance of the 19th and 20th centuries was tipped because a general decided to close his eyes for a few hours.
For our 13th story, we head to the year 1204, to a moment that shattered the unity of the Christian world and accelerated the collapse of the Eastern Roman Empire. While the fall of Constantinople in 1453, which we covered in Chapter 4, was the final nail in the coffin, the beginning of the end happened 2 centuries earlier because of a disastrous diplomatic misunderstanding and a series of broken promises. This is the story of the Fourth Crusade, the holy war that accidentally attacked its own side. The plan was simple. The Pope wanted to reclaim Jerusalem from the Muslims. A massive Crusader army was assembled in Venice, ready to sail to Egypt. However, there was a major problem. The Crusaders didn't have enough money to pay the Venetians for the ships they had built. The Venetians, being shrewd businessmen, refused to let the army leave until they were paid in full. In this moment of desperation, a young prince named Alexios Angelos appeared. He was the son of the recently deposed Byzantine emperor. He made the Crusaders a deal they couldn't refuse. He promised that if the Crusaders helped him regain his throne in Constantinople, he would pay off their entire debt to the Venetians, provide them with 10,000 soldiers for the crusade, and bring the Greek Orthodox Church back under the authority of the Pope. It was a geopolitical get-rich-quick scheme. The Crusaders agreed, sailed to Constantinople, and successfully installed Alexios IV as emperor. But then came the blunder. Alexios quickly realized he had made promises he couldn't keep. The imperial treasury was empty. When he tried to melt down ancient icons and tax the citizens to pay the Crusaders, the city rioted. Alexios was strangled in a palace coup, and the new government told the Crusaders to go away empty-handed. The Crusaders were now stuck outside the walls of the world's richest city, hungry, broke, and furious. On April 12, 1204, they decided that if they weren't going to be paid, they would simply take what they were owed. The ensuing sack of Constantinople was one of the most shameful events in history. For 3 days, the holy warriors murdered, raped, and looted. They stripped the gold off the altars of the Hagia Sophia and destroyed ancient Greek statues that had survived since the time of Alexander the Great. They stole the 4 bronze horses that now sit in St. Mark's Square in Venice. The mistake here was twofold: the Crusaders' greed and the prince's impossible promises. By sacking Constantinople, the Crusaders didn't just enrich themselves, they permanently crippled the Byzantine Empire, the shield of the West. The empire was broken into tiny, warring fragments that could no longer defend Europe from the rising Ottoman Turks. Furthermore, the sack of 1204 created a hatred between the Catholic West and the Orthodox East that has never truly healed. It ensured that when the Turks finally did arrive at the gates in 1453, the Christians of Europe were too divided to stand together. The Holy War ended up destroying the very people it was supposed to protect, all because of a bad debt and a prince who lied on his resume. In the early days of June 1944, the fate of the modern world hung on a single swirling, low-pressure system over the Atlantic Ocean. The Allies were preparing for Operation Overlord, the Normandy invasion of D-Day. It was the largest seaborne invasion in history, a massive gamble that, if failed, would have left Nazi Germany in control of Europe for decades.
The success of the invasion depended on a very narrow window of perfect conditions: a late rising moon for paratroopers, a low tide at dawn to reveal German beach obstacles, and most importantly, calm seas and clear skies. But as the scheduled date of June 5th approached, the English Channel was hit by the worst weather in 20 years. Gale force winds and churning waves made an invasion look impossible. This is where the German High Command made a catastrophic, logical mistake. The German chief meteorologist, Major Walter Stobe, looked at the same storm clouds the Allies were looking at. He concluded that the weather was so foul that no military commander in their right mind would attempt a crossing. He told the German generals that they could relax. The invasion window had closed for at least 2 weeks. Based on this expert weather report, the German defenders let their guard down. General Erwin Rommel, the man in charge of defending the French coast, decided it was the perfect time to take a break. He left his headquarters in France and drove all the way to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday and give her a pair of Parisian shoes. Many other senior commanders left their posts to attend war games in Brittany. But across the Channel, a quiet Scottish meteorologist named James Stagg had spotted something the Germans had missed: a tiny 24-hour break in the storm, a brief lull where the winds would die down just enough. General Dwight Eisenhower took the gamble. "Okay," he famously said, "we'll go." When the sun rose on June 6, 1944, the German coastal lookouts were horrified to see the horizon filled with 5,000 ships. Because of the bad weather report, the German response was a disaster. Rommel was hundreds of miles away. The Luftwaffe planes were grounded. Most crucially, the elite Panzer tank divisions, the only force capable of pushing the Allies back into the sea, were held in reserve. No one dared to wake Adolf Hitler, who was sleeping late at his mountain retreat, to ask for permission to move the tanks. By the time the Germans realized that the impossible weather had allowed a window for the Allies, the beachheads were established. The Atlantic Wall had been breached. If the German weather experts had been just a bit more cautious, or if Rommel had stayed at the front instead of going to a birthday party, the D-Day invasion might have been a bloodbath that pushed the Allies back into the sea. A failed D-Day would likely have led to a negotiated peace with Hitler or the total Soviet occupation of all Europe. Instead, the Western Allies gained their foothold, and the liberation of Europe began, all because of one side trusted a weather forecast a little too much.
In the high-stakes chess match of the Cold War, the distance between a successful revolution and a humiliating disaster was often measured in minutes, and sometimes in the simple misunderstanding of a clock. In April 1961, the United States launched one of its most infamous covert operations, the Bay of Pigs invasion. The goal was to overthrow Fidel Castro's young communist government in Cuba. But the plan didn't fail because of Cuban military might. It failed because the CIA and the U.S. military forgot to synchronize their watches. The plan relied on a group of CIA-trained Cuban exiles known as Brigade 2506 landing on the beaches under the cover of darkness. For the invasion to succeed, the exiles needed total air superiority. President John F. Kennedy, wary of showing American fingerprints on the operation, had authorized a limited number of airstrikes by B-26 bombers to destroy Castro's tiny air force on the ground. On the morning of April 19, the invasion was faltering. The exiles were pinned down on the beaches, running out of ammunition and being hammered by Castro's remaining jets. In a desperate move, the CIA convinced Kennedy to authorize 1 hour of air cover. 6 American fighter jets from the carrier USS Essex were ordered to fly over the bay to protect the bombers. But then, the big oops happened. The Pentagon and the CIA were operating on different time zones. The CIA coordinators in Nicaragua were using local time, while the U.S. Navy pilots on the Essex were using Zulu, Greenwich Mean Time. In the frantic exchange of coded messages, no one double-checked the conversion.
The B-26 bombers arrived over the Bay of Pigs exactly on schedule, but they were an hour early for their escort. The American fighter jets were still sitting on the deck of the aircraft carrier, their pilots drinking coffee and waiting for their start time. Left completely unprotected, the slow-moving bombers were sitting ducks. Castro's Sea Furies and T-33 jets swooped in, shooting down the lead bombers and forcing the others to flee. By the time the American fighter jets finally arrived an hour later, the bombers were gone, the Exile Brigade had been shattered, and the secret invasion had become a global embarrassment for the United States. The consequences of this 60-minute math error were astronomical. The failure at the Bay of Pigs made Kennedy look weak and indecisive to the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. Believing the U.S. wouldn't act, Khrushchev felt emboldened to ship nuclear missiles to Cuba just a year later. This led directly to the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest the human race has ever come to total nuclear annihilation. If the CIA had simply synced their watches with the Navy, the invasion might have succeeded. Castro might have been ousted, and the world would never have spent 13 days staring down the barrel of a nuclear World War III. History was nearly ended by a time zone mix-up. While we have looked at errors that destroyed empires, some mistakes were so profound they accidentally birthed an entire industry, the American oil boom. In the late 19th century, the United States was a country hungry for energy, but no one knew exactly where the black gold was hiding. This is the story of Patillo Higgins, a self-taught geologist who was convinced that a small hill near Beaumont, Texas, called Spindletop, was sitting on a massive reservoir of oil. At the time, every expert in the world laughed at him. The official U.S. Geological Survey, USG, had published maps and reports stating that the Gulf Coast of Texas had absolutely no oil. The rocks were the wrong type, they said. Higgins was persistent, but he was also broke. He eventually teamed up with Anthony Lucas, a mining engineer. In late 1900, they began drilling into the hill. For months, they hit nothing but sand and mud. Lucas's equipment was failing, his money was gone, and his backers were pulling out. The experts pointed to their maps and told Lucas he was chasing a ghost. On January 10, 1901, they reached a depth of 1,139 feet. Suddenly, the drill bit got stuck. Mud began bubbling up, followed by a terrifying sound like a freight train coming from deep underground. The drill pipes were shot out of the ground like toothpicks. Then it happened. A geyser of thick black crude oil erupted 100 feet into the air. It was a gusher the likes of which the world had never seen. It was producing 100,000 barrels of oil a day, more than all the other wells in the world at that time. The mistake here was the arrogance of the established scientific community. Because they had drawn their maps and decided where oil couldn't be, they had ignored the most productive oil field in history. If Lucas had listened to the maps, he would have stopped drilling just 100 feet above the reservoir. The ripple effect of this lucky persistence was the birth of the modern age. Before Spindletop, oil was used mainly for lamps and lubrication. After Spindletop, oil became so cheap and abundant that it replaced coal as the world's primary fuel. This allowed for the mass production of the automobile, the rise of the airline industry, and the rapid expansion of the shipping trade. Companies like Texaco and Gulf Oil were born from this single well. The United States became the world's leading industrial power because it had suddenly found the world's cheapest energy source on a hill where it wasn't supposed to be. If the geologists had been right, or if the drillers had followed the map, the 20th century would have stayed in the age of steam and horses. The world moved forward because two men decided the maps were wrong.
By 1917, World War I had been raging for 3 years, and the United States was determined to stay out of it. President Woodrow Wilson had even won re-election on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." The American public had no desire to send their sons to die in a European meat grinder. It would have taken a monumental shift in public opinion to change that, and that shift came in the form of a coded message and a staggering German diplomatic blunder. The protagonist of this mistake was Arthur Zimmermann, the German Foreign Secretary. Germany was feeling the squeeze of the British naval blockade and was planning to resume unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking any ship, including American merchant vessels, heading to Britain. Zimmermann knew this would likely provoke the U.S. into declaring war. To distract the Americans, Zimmermann came up with a brilliant plan. He would invite Mexico to join the war as a German ally. In exchange, Germany promised to help Mexico reconquer the lost territory in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. On January 16, 1917, Zimmermann sent this proposal in a secret coded telegram to the German ambassador in Mexico. But there was a major security flaw. Because the British had cut Germany's undersea telegraph cables at the start of the war, Germany was forced to send its diplomatic messages through neutral cables, including those belonging to the Americans. The British Signals Intelligence Unit, known as Room 40, intercepted the telegram. They cracked the code and realized they held a political nuclear bomb. If they showed it to the Americans, it would almost certainly force the U.S. into the war on the British side. The blunder wasn't just sending the telegram, it was Zimmermann's reaction when it was leaked. When the Zimmermann telegram was published in American newspapers, many people thought it was a British forgery designed to trick them into the war. Had Zimmermann simply stayed quiet or denied it, the American public might have remained skeptical. Instead, in a move of baffling honesty, Zimmermann stood up in the German Reichstag and admitted, "I cannot deny it. It is true." The American public exploded in fury. The idea of Germany carving up the American Southwest and handing it to Mexico turned isolationists into interventionists overnight. On April 6, 1917, the United States officially declared war on Germany. The arrival of millions of fresh American troops and the vast industrial power of the U.S. broke the stalemate and led to Germany's total defeat in 1918. Without the Zimmermann telegram, the U.S. might have stayed neutral, and Germany could have won the war of attrition in Europe. A single, poorly secured telegram and a moment of unnecessary honesty by a German official redrew the map of the world and established the United States as a global military powerhouse for the first time. As we approach the end of the 20th century, we find a story where the fate of the world's largest nation and the safety of its nuclear arsenal rested not on grand ideology, but on a failure of basic logistics and a few missing pieces of equipment. This is the story of the 1991 Soviet coup attempt, the OPS that accidentally killed the Soviet Union. In August 1991, a group of hardline Communist Party leaders, known as the Gang of Eight, decided they had seen enough of Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms. They wanted to return to the iron-fisted days of the old USSR. They placed Gorbachev under house arrest at his vacation home and rolled tanks into the streets of Moscow. They expected the people to cower and the military to follow orders blindly. But the coup leaders made a series of baffling, amateur mistakes. First, they forgot to cut the phone lines at the Russian Parliament building, where Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Republic, was rallying the opposition. Second, and more importantly, they failed to seize the television stations and radio towers immediately. While the coup leaders held a stiff, awkward press conference where their hands were visibly shaking on camera, Yeltsin was outside, standing on top of a tank, calling for a general strike. The world was watching the coup fail in real time on live TV. The most critical blunder happened within the military. The elite Alpha Group was ordered to storm the Parliament building and arrest Yeltsin. This was a highly trained unit that could have ended the resistance in minutes. But when the commanders arrived to survey the scene, they found a massive crowd of thousands of unarmed civilians forming a human shield around the building. The coup leaders had failed to provide the soldiers with non-lethal equipment.
No tear gas, no riot shields, and no water cannons. Their only options were to do nothing or to order a massacre of thousands of their own citizens on live global TV. The soldiers, realizing the incompetence of their leaders and unwilling to trigger a civil war, simply refused to move. Within 3 days, the coup collapsed. The hardliners were arrested, and Gorbachev returned to Moscow, but his power was gone. Yeltsin emerged as the true leader. The failure of the coup acted as a catalyst. The Communist Party was banned, and the republics of the Soviet Union began to declare independence one by one. By December 1991, the Soviet Union, a superpower that had shaped the world for 70 years, ceased to exist. If the Gang of Eight had been more competent, if they had simply cut the phones or brought riot gear, they might have succeeded in rolling back the clock. Instead, their clumsy oops moments accelerated the collapse of an empire and ended the Cold War once and for all.
As we move into the digital age, the simple mistakes of history stop being about lost keys or misplaced cigars and start being about the tiny lines of code that run our world. In 1962, the United States was locked in a frantic space race with the Soviet Union. NASA was preparing to launch Mariner 1, the first planetary spacecraft designed to fly past Venus. It was a mission of immense national pride and scientific importance. The rocket took off from Cape Canaveral on July 22, 1962. For the first few moments, everything seemed perfect. But just 4 minutes into the flight, the Atlas Agena rocket began to fishtail wildly. It was deviating from its course, veering dangerously toward shipping lanes in the Atlantic Ocean. Fearing a catastrophic crash on land or sea, the range safety officer sent the command to self-destruct. $18.5 million, over $160 million in today's money, turned into a fireball in the sky. The subsequent investigation revealed a mistake so small it was almost invisible. In the handwritten mathematical formulas used to program the rocket's guidance system, a transcriber had missed a single hyphen, often referred to as the missing overbar. In the coding language of the time, that tiny bar over a symbol represented a smoothed or averaged value for velocity. Without that bar, the computer didn't smooth out the data. Instead, it reacted to every tiny normal vibration of the rocket as if it were a massive course deviation. The computer tried to correct these tiny tremors with violent maneuvers, eventually shaking the rocket right off its path. The famous science fiction writer Arthur C. Clarke called it the most expensive hyphen in history. This blunder was a wake-up call for the burgeoning tech world. It proved that in the age of automation, a human error that takes half a second to commit can destroy years of work and millions of dollars in an instant. It led to the creation of much more rigorous software testing and verification processes at NASA. Had Mariner 1 succeeded, the U.S. would have claimed a massive victory over the Soviets much earlier in the decade. Instead, the missing hyphen gave the USSR more time to catch up. It remains a haunting reminder that as our technology becomes more complex, the butterfly effect of our mistakes only gets smaller, faster, and more expensive. For our final chapter, we look at how a simple loaf of bread and a king's refusal to understand the hunger of his people triggered the most violent and transformative social explosion in Western history, the French Revolution. While history books often focus on Enlightenment philosophy, the spark that actually lit the fuse was a catastrophic economic blunder involving the price of flour. In the late 1700s, France was the most powerful nation in Europe, but it was also the most deeply in debt. King Louis XVI, wanting to modernize the economy, appointed a series of ministers who decided to implement free trade for grain. They believed if they stopped regulating the price of bread, the market would stabilize itself. The mistake was one of timing and empathy.
Just as the government deregulated the market, France was hit by a series of horrific harvests and a brutal winter. Without price controls, the cost of a single loaf of bread skyrocketed to equal a month's wages for a common worker. The oops moment here was the monarchy's total disconnect from reality. While the people of Paris were literally starving in the streets, the royal court at Versailles continued to host lavish banquets. When the king was warned that the people were rioting because there was no bread, the aristocracy's response was essentially a shrug of the shoulders. Though the famous line, "Let them eat cake," was likely never actually said by Marie Antoinette, it perfectly captured the government's fatal mistake, the failure to provide the most basic human necessity. On October 5, 1789, the mistake reached its boiling point. A crowd of thousands of women, desperate to feed their children, marched from Paris to Versailles. They weren't armed with grand political theories. They were armed with kitchen knives and pikes, demanding bread. They broke into the palace, nearly killed the queen, and forced the royal family to return to Paris as virtual prisoners of the people. This was the point of no return. The king's failure to manage the food supply broke the divine contract between the ruler and the ruled. The French Revolution escalated into the Reign of Terror, the execution of the king and queen, and the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, whose wars would reshape every border in Europe. The modern concept of human rights, the metric system, and the secular state all emerged from the chaos of the French Revolution. It was a global earthquake that started because a king made a market adjustment without checking if his people had enough to eat for breakfast. It proves that the most powerful empires are only 3 missed meals away from a revolution.
Wait, we've spoken of Constantinople's fall in 1453, but there was another open-door moment that happened much earlier, one that fundamentally broke the world's balance of power. This is the story of the Siege of Antioch in 1098 during the First Crusade. If not for a single disgruntled tower guard and a massive lapse in military discipline, the Crusades likely would have ended right there, and the history of the Middle East would have looked entirely different. The Crusaders had been stuck outside the massive walls of Antioch for 8 agonizing months. They were starving, eating their own horses, and even boiling their leather boots for sustenance. Outside the city walls, a massive Muslim relief army led by Kerboga was approaching. The Crusaders were trapped between the high walls of the city and a superior force closing in from behind. They were days away from total annihilation. The mistake was made by the city's commander, Yagi Sian. He had recently demoted and publicly humiliated a captain of the guard named Firuz, an armor maker who was in charge of the Tower of the Two Sisters. Firuz, seeking revenge for the insult, managed to send a secret message to the Crusader leader, Bohemond. He told him that if the Crusaders could reach his tower under the cover of night, he would leave a single window open and drop a leather rope. On the night of June 2nd, 1098, a small group of knights scaled the wall through that one neglected window. They overpowered the nearby guards and opened the city gates. The Crusader army poured in, capturing the city just 1 day before the massive relief army arrived. If Yagi Sian had simply been a more diplomatic leader, or if he had replaced the guard he had offended, the Crusaders would have starved to death outside those walls. The First Crusade would have failed, the Kingdom of Jerusalem would never have been established, and the centuries of conflict and cultural exchange between the West and the Islamic world might never have taken the shape they did. This one open window ensured that the Crusader presence in the Levant would last for 200 years, influencing everything from the architecture of European castles to the introduction of sugar and spices to the Western diet. A single man's bruised ego and an unlocked window allowed an entire movement to survive against impossible odds. We often think of the city of New York as a purely British creation, but its birth was actually the result of one of the most lopsided and accidental trades in human history. In the 1600s, the Dutch and the British were bitter rivals for global trade.
They fought wars over spices, specifically nutmeg, which at the time was more valuable than gold. The center of the nutmeg world was a tiny mosquito-infested island in the East Indies called Run. The Dutch wanted it desperately to complete their monopoly on the spice trade. The British held it, but they were also holding a relatively useless, muddy outpost in North America called New Amsterdam. In 1667, during the negotiations for the Treaty of Breda, both sides made what they thought was a brilliant tactical move. The Dutch, looking at their maps, saw that the island of Run was a gold mine of spices. They looked at New Amsterdam and saw a swampy settlement that produced nothing of immediate value. The mistake was the Dutch's failure to see the long-term potential of the wrong map. They traded their claim to New Amsterdam and the surrounding territory to the British in exchange for total control of the tiny island of Run. The British immediately renamed New Amsterdam to New York. At the time, the Dutch thought they had won the lottery. They had secured the nutmeg trade, which made them the richest nation on earth for a few decades. But nutmeg prices eventually crashed as the spice was planted elsewhere. Meanwhile, the useless swamp the British acquired became the financial capital of the world, the gateway for millions of immigrants, and the heart of the American empire. The Dutch's focus on short-term spices over long-term land meant they traded away the most valuable piece of real estate in human history for an island that most people today couldn't find on a map. If the Dutch had held on to Manhattan, the United States might have been a Dutch-speaking nation, or perhaps it never would have unified at all. New York exists as an English-speaking titan because of a trade that looked like a mistake only through the lens of time.
For over a century, some of the world's most brilliant explorers, cartographers, and kings believed in a geographic ghost. From roughly 1622 until the mid-1700s, European maps consistently depicted California as an island physically separated from the North American mainland by a fictional body of water called the Gulf of California, or the Red Sea. This wasn't just a minor scribble. It was a persistent, multi-generational blunder that influenced naval expeditions and colonial strategy. The mistake began with a Spanish Carmelite friar named Antonio de la Ascensión, who accompanied an expedition up the coast in 1602. He misinterpreted the entrance to the Gulf of California as a strait that continued all the way to the Northwest Passage. He drew a map reflecting this, and despite earlier explorations by Hernán Cortés and others who correctly identified California as a peninsula, this new island map went viral in the 17th century since. The mistake was reinforced by confirmation bias. Explorers who sailed into the Gulf of California often turned back before reaching the northern end, where the Colorado River enters, assuming the water ahead just kept going. Because European kings wanted a shortcut to the Orient, they wanted the map to be true. This plunder had real-world consequences. Spanish missions and supply lines were planned around the idea of a sea crossing that didn't exist. Ships carrying vital supplies would sail north, expecting to find a passage to the Pacific, only to find themselves trapped in the cul-de-sac of the Gulf. It delayed the terrestrial exploration of the American West by decades. The error was so stubborn that in 1747, King Ferdinand VI of Spain had to issue a royal decree officially stating, "California is not an island." It took a literal king's command to override a century of bad paperwork. It serves as a reminder that once a mistake is printed on a map or programmed into an algorithm, it becomes a truth that is incredibly hard to erase. We return to the American Civil War for one of the most improbable oops moments in military history. In September 1862, Robert E. Lee and the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia had crossed into Maryland. Lee's plan was to threaten Washington, D.C. and Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, potentially forcing the North to recognize Southern independence. To coordinate his divided forces, Lee wrote out Special Order 191.
This document detailed the exact locations and marching routes for every wing of his army. It was the holy grail of military intelligence. A copy of this order was sent to Confederate General D.H. Hill. However, one of Hill's staff officers committed a mistake that should have been impossible. He used the secret order as the wrapping for 3 cigars, then accidentally dropped the bundle in a meadow near Frederick, Maryland. A few days later, 2 Union soldiers from the 27th Indiana Regiment were resting in that same meadow. They spotted the bundle in the grass. Expecting a midday smoke, they opened it only to find the most sensitive military document of the war. When the map and orders reached Union General McClellan, he famously exclaimed, "Here is a paper with which, if I cannot whip Bobby Lee, I will be willing to go home." Equipped with Lee's entire playbook, the Union Army intercepted the Confederates at the Battle of Antietam. It was the bloodiest single day in American history. While the battle was technically a draw, it forced Lee to retreat from Maryland. More importantly, the Union victory gave President Abraham Lincoln the political cover he needed to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. If that staff officer hadn't been careless with his cigars, Lee likely would have caught the Union Army off guard, potentially winning a major victory on Northern soil and securing British or French recognition for the Confederacy. The abolition of slavery and the survival of the United States as a single nation were decided by a bundle of tobacco left in the grass.
The year is 1862. The United States is a bleeding wound torn in half by a civil war that many believe the North is destined to lose. Imagine a world where the United States never became a global superpower because it ceased to exist in the 19th century. That reality was only a few inches of paper away. On a humid September morning in Frederick, Maryland, a Union corporal named Barton W. Mitchell spotted a bulky envelope lying in a field recently vacated by Confederate troops. Inside, he didn't find gold or ammunition. He found 3 cigars wrapped in a piece of paper. To a tired soldier, the cigars were a prize. The paper was trash. But as he unrolled that paper, the blood drained from his face. He wasn't looking at a letter home or a supply list. He was holding Special Order 191, the entire detailed invasion plan of General Robert E. Lee. This single sheet of paper contained the exact locations and movements of the entire Confederate Army. At that moment, Lee's forces were divided and vulnerable, a strategic gamble that could have ended the war in a weekend if kept secret. But because of a careless staff officer who used the most important document in American history as a cigar wrapper, the invincible Robert E. Lee was suddenly walking into a trap he didn't know existed. The stakes couldn't have been higher. If Lee's Maryland campaign had succeeded, European powers like Britain and France were prepared to officially recognize the Confederacy, providing the South with the money and naval power needed to crush the North forever. The map of the world was about to be rewritten by a gust of wind and a dropped envelope. When the document reached Union General George McClellan, he famously exclaimed, "Here is a paper with which, if I cannot whip Bobby Lee, I will be willing to go home." The intelligence was perfect. It told him that Lee had split his army into 5 columns, scattered miles apart. For the first time in the war, the Union had the ultimate cheat code. They knew where the enemy was, where they were going, and exactly how many men they had. The American experiment, the end of slavery, and the future of the North American continent now rested on whether McClellan could move fast enough to exploit a mistake made by a nameless courier. But history is rarely a straight line. Even with the greatest intelligence haul in military history, the small error created a ripple effect of hesitation and blood. As the sun began to rise over the hills of Sharpsburg near Antietam Creek, the world stood on a knife's edge. This was no longer just a battle. It was the moment where a misplaced cigar wrapper forced a collision that would result in the bloodiest single day in American history. Had that paper stayed in that field, the Union might have been blindsided, Washington, D.C. might have fallen, and the 20th century as we know it, with a unified America, would never have happened.
The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and the realization that the fate of millions of lives was decided not by a grand strategy, but by a moment of human clumsiness. As the lines of blue and gray began to clash in the cornfields of Maryland, the ghost of that lost envelope hung over the battlefield. Every gunshot was an echo of a simple truth. The most powerful empires in the world are often held together by nothing more than a scrap of paper and the hope that no one drops it. The discovery of Special Order 191 should have been the end of the Confederacy. General McClellan had the golden ticket, but the small error of the lost document was about to be met by another human failure, the paralysis of command. Despite having Lee's entire playbook in his hands, McClellan waited 18 hours before moving. That delay, a mere tick on the clock of history, allowed a thin veil of secrecy to remain just long enough for Lee to realize something was wrong. A Confederate sympathizer had seen McClellan receive the paper and hurried to warn Lee. The hunt was on, and the prize was the soul of a nation. On September 17, 1862, the two armies collided at the Battle of Antietam. Because of that dropped cigar wrapper, the Union was able to intercept Lee, forcing a battle that Lee had never intended to fight on those terms. The result was a level of carnage that the American continent had never seen before and has never seen since. By sunset, over 23,000 men were dead, wounded, or missing. The fields of Sharpsburg were literally carpeted with bodies in blue and gray. But while the battle was technically a draw, the strategic consequence of the lost order was absolute. Lee was forced to retreat. The invasion of the North had failed. The small error of a clumsy staff officer now triggered a geopolitical earthquake. Before Antietam, President Lincoln had the Emancipation Proclamation drafted, but it was sitting in his desk drawer. He couldn't issue it while the Union was losing. It would have looked like a cry of desperation. But the victory at Antietam, bought by the intelligence found in that field, gave Lincoln the political capital he needed. 5 days after the battle, he issued the preliminary proclamation. Suddenly, the war was no longer just about preserving a union. It was a crusade against slavery. This shift was the final nail in the coffin for the Confederate diplomacy. In London and Paris, the ruling elite had been watching the American war like a chess match. They wanted the cheap cotton from the South and were looking for any excuse to intervene. But once the war became about the abolition of slavery, it became politically impossible for Britain or France to join the side of the South. The British public, which had long since abolished slavery, would never have allowed their government to fight for the right of one man to own another. The misplaced cigar wrapper didn't just lose a battle, it cut off the Confederacy's only hope for international survival. Imagine the alternate world where that officer hadn't dropped those cigars. Lee likely would have marched deeper into Pennsylvania, perhaps seizing Harrisburg or even threatening Philadelphia. The North, demoralized and broken, might have sued for peace. We would be looking at a North America divided into 2 or 3 smaller competing nations, much like 19th century Europe. There would have been no unified American industrial titan to tip the scales of World War I or World War II. The entire trajectory of the 20th century, the Cold War, the moon landing, the internet, rests on the fact that one man in a Maryland field was careless with his tobacco. As the smoke cleared from Antietam, the world had changed forever. A single mistake had saved a nation, ended an institution of human bondage, and set the stage for a global superpower. But history wasn't done with small errors. In the next chapter, we move forward in time to a different part of the world, where a wrong turn by a driver in a crowded street city didn't just start a battle, it ignited a world war that would claim 20 million lives.
History is often viewed as a series of grand, inevitable movements, but in June of 1914, the fate of the entire planet was decided by a driver who simply didn't know the local geography. We move from the tobacco fields of Maryland to the dusty, tense streets of Sarajevo, Bosnia. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was visiting a city that was a powder keg of ethnic tension. Assassins were already in the shadows, armed with bombs and pistols, waiting for their chance to strike. But here's the twist. The assassins actually failed. Their first attempt involved a grenade that missed the Archduke's car, injuring bystanders instead. The plot was blown, the security was compromised, and the Archduke should have been rushed to safety. Instead, in a tragic bravery, Ferdinand insisted on visiting the hospital to check on those wounded by the grenade. This change in plans was the first domino. However, the true small error occurred because no one clearly communicated the new route to the Archduke's driver, Leopold Loika. As the royal motorcade moved through the city, Loika took a right turn onto Franz Joseph Street, following the original plan. One of the Archduke's officials shouted from the car, "What is this? This is the wrong way. We're supposed to go straight." Loika slammed on the brakes to reverse. In any other moment in history, a stalled car is a minor annoyance, but Loika had stopped the car directly in front of a delicatessen where a 19-year-old Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip was sitting. Princip had been part of the failed assassination team earlier that morning. He had given up, thinking the opportunity was gone, and had stopped to buy a sandwich. He looked up from his meal and couldn't believe his eyes. The target of his mission was sitting in a stationary, open-top car, less than 5 feet away, because of a wrong turn and a stalled engine. Princip didn't hesitate. He pulled his pistol and fired 2 shots. Those 2 bullets didn't just kill the Archduke and his wife, they shattered the delicate piece of the entire globe. Because of a driver's confusion and a few seconds of a stalled motor, the alliance system of Europe was triggered like a row of falling landmines. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia mobilized to protect Serbia. Germany mobilized to support Austria. France and Britain were dragged in by treaty. Within weeks, the wrong turn in Sarajevo had spiraled into World War I, a conflict that would introduce tanks, chemical weapons, and industrial-scale slaughter to the human experience. The scale of the disaster born from this 5-second driving mistake is almost impossible to wrap the mind around. The war led to the collapse of 4 empires: the German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian. It created the vacuum that allowed the Bolsheviks to rise to power in Russia, giving birth to the Soviet Union. It left Germany in such economic ruin and psychological bitterness that it paved the way for the rise of Adolf Hitler and the horrors of the Second World War. If the driver had just stayed on the main road, the 20th century might have been a century of peace and slow reform, rather than one of total war and genocide. We like to think that the course of humanity is guided by great leaders and massive social shifts, but when you look at the streets of Sarajevo in 1914, you see the terrifying truth. The modern world, with all its technology and its trauma, was built on a wrong turn. A sandwich, a confused driver, and a stalled car were the ingredients for a catastrophe that claimed 20 million lives. But as we will see in the next chapter, small errors don't just happen on the battlefield or in city streets. Sometimes they happen in a quiet laboratory, and instead of bringing death, they change the way we live forever. While some small errors ignite wars that burn down empires, others happen in the quiet, mundane moments of a messy office. In 1928, the world was a terrifying place for anyone with a simple scratch or a sore throat. Before this year, a basic infection was often a death sentence. Doctors were powerless against bacteria. If you stepped on a rusty nail or contracted pneumonia, your survival was essentially a coin flip. The medical community was searching for a magic bullet, but they were looking for it through grueling, intentional research. No one expected that the greatest medical breakthrough in human history would come from a man who simply forgot to clean his room. Alexander Fleming, a Scottish biologist working at St. Mary's Hospital in London, was known for being a brilliant scientist, but a notoriously untidy one. In August of 1928, Fleming decided to take a 2-week vacation with his family. Before he left,
He had been studying staphylococci, the bacteria responsible for boils, sore throats, and abscesses. In his haste to get away, he didn't properly clean his laboratory benches. He left a stack of petri dishes filled with the deadly bacteria sitting out in the open, rather than placing them in an incubator or cleaning them with disinfectant. It was a lapse in professional protocol that would have gotten a junior researcher fired. While Fleming was away, a series of lucky atmospheric events occurred. A cooling trend in London allowed a specific type of rare mold spore, likely drifting up from a mycology lab on the floor below, to settle onto one of Fleming's neglected plates. When Fleming returned from his vacation on September 3rd, he began sorting through his mess, intending to dump the contaminated dishes into a vat of acid. But he stopped. He noticed something strange on one particular dish. A patch of mold had grown, and around that mold there was a clear circle where the staphylococci bacteria had simply vanished. It was as if the mold had created a no-fly zone for death. Fleming famously remarked, "That's funny." He realized that the mold, Penicillium notatum, was secreting a substance that didn't just inhibit the bacteria, it tore them apart. This was the birth of penicillin. However, the small error of leaving the window open or the dishes unwashed was only the beginning. For years, Fleming struggled to turn this mold juice into a stable medicine. It sat as a laboratory curiosity until the brink of World War II, when researchers at Oxford University rediscovered his findings and figured out how to mass produce it. The impact of this mistake is staggering. Before penicillin, the average human life expectancy was significantly lower, largely because infectious diseases killed the young and old alike. During World War II, penicillin was dubbed the wonder drug, saving countless soldiers from gangrene and wound infections that would have previously required amputation or resulted in agonizing death. It is estimated that Fleming's messy desk has saved over 200 million lives since that fateful morning in September. Every time you take an antibiotic for an ear infection or a dental procedure, you are benefiting from a scientist who forgot to wash his dishes. If Fleming had been a perfectionist, if he had cleaned his lab that Friday afternoon, the age of antibiotics might have been delayed by decades, or might never have happened at all. Millions would have died from diseases we now consider minor inconveniences. It serves as a profound reminder. While a wrong turn can start a war, a moment of human laziness can sometimes provide the cure for the world's greatest ills. But as we move into the next chapter, we will see that not all laboratory errors are so benevolent. Sometimes a tiny calculation mistake can lead to a multi-million-dollar disaster in the cold vacuum of space.
In the late 1990s, humanity was looking toward the stars with renewed ambition. NASA had spent years and hundreds of millions of dollars developing the Mars Climate Orbiter, a sophisticated robotic space probe designed to study the Martian atmosphere and act as a communications relay for future missions. It was a masterpiece of engineering, a shining example of what the brightest minds on Earth could achieve. But in the vacuum of space, there is no room for pretty close. In September 1999, after a 10-month journey across nearly 300 million miles of void, this massive project was destroyed by something you would find in a fifth-grade classroom: a failure to convert units. The error didn't happen in space. It was baked into the code months before launch. One team of engineers at Lockheed Martin, who built the spacecraft, used the English imperial system, inches, feet, and pounds, to calculate the force of the thrusters. Meanwhile, the navigation team at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL, assumed the data they were receiving was in the metric system, newtons and meters, which is the standard for international science. It was a silent, invisible discrepancy. For nearly a year, as the probe drifted toward the red planet, the two teams were essentially speaking different languages without realizing it. As the orbiter reached Mars, it prepared to fire its engines to slip into a stable orbit.
Because of the unit mix-up, the computer thought the thrusters were pushing with one amount of force, while they were actually pushing with another. Specifically, the software calculated the impulse in pound-seconds, but the ground software expected newton-seconds. 1 pound of force is roughly 4.45 newtons. This meant the thrusters were significantly more powerful than the navigation software intended. On the day of arrival, the flight controllers watched their screens with bated breath. The orbiter was supposed to pass about 140 to 150 kilometers above the Martian surface. Instead, because of that small math error, the probe dove down to just 57 kilometers. At that altitude, the Martian atmosphere isn't a vacuum, it's a wall. The spacecraft, never designed to withstand the heat and friction of an atmospheric entry, likely skipped off the air like a stone on water, or disintegrated into a trail of fire and debris. In an instant, $125 million, over $230 million in today's money, evaporated. Years of research, the work of hundreds of scientists, and a vital piece of Martian exploration history were lost because no one checked the labels on their numbers. The small error here wasn't a lack of intelligence, it was a lack of communication. It was the ultimate facepalm moment in the history of space exploration, proving that even when we are reaching for other worlds, we can still be tripped up by the simplest earthly mistakes. The Mars Climate Orbiter disaster became a legendary cautionary tale in engineering schools across the globe. It forced NASA to overhaul its quality control and communication protocols, ensuring that every single unit, decimal point, and line of code is verified by multiple sets of eyes. But as we look to the final chapter of our story, we see an error that was even smaller, one that happened deep inside a nuclear power plant, where a single stuck valve almost turned the American East Coast into a radioactive wasteland. While the vacuum of space is unforgiving, the heart of a nuclear reactor is a place where perfection isn't just a goal, it's a requirement for survival. On March 28, 1979, on a quiet island near the Susquehanna River near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, a mechanical hiccup the size of a coffee cup almost ended the American dream of nuclear energy. The 3 Mile Island accident remains the most significant nuclear incident in U.S. history, and it didn't start with a massive explosion or a terrorist attack. It started with a tiny piece of hardware that simply failed to do its one and only job. At 4 a.m., a relatively minor malfunction occurred in the secondary cooling system, causing the temperature in the reactor core to rise. To handle this, a pilot-operated relief valve, or PORV, opened automatically to release the excess pressure. This was exactly what it was designed to do. However, when the pressure dropped back down to safe levels, the valve didn't close. It was stuck open. A tiny mechanical snag, likely caused by a small amount of debris or a worn-out seal, created an open wound in the heart of the cooling system. The small error was compounded by a catastrophic failure in human-machine interface. On the control panel in the booth, a light turned on indicating that the computer had ordered the valve to close. The operators took this light to mean the valve was actually closed. In reality, the light only reflected the command, not the physical state of the valve. For nearly 2 critical hours, coolant was screaming out of the stuck valve, and the operators, the very people trained to prevent a disaster, had no idea they were losing the liquid that kept the reactor from turning into a molten pool of radioactive lava. As the water levels dropped, the top of the nuclear fuel rods became exposed. The temperature skyrocketed to over 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The zirconium cladding on the fuel rods began to react with the steam, creating a massive bubble of hydrogen gas inside the reactor vessel. The engineers were flying blind, fighting a ghost. They thought they had too much water, so they actually turned off the emergency cooling pumps, unintentionally accelerating the disaster. It was a comedy of errors played out on the edge of a nuclear apocalypse. By the time the truth was discovered, half the core had melted, a full-scale China syndrome where the molten fuel burns through the containment building and into the groundwater was narrowly avoided by a matter of minutes. While no one died directly from the radiation at 3 Mile Island, the psychological and political fallout was radioactive. It terrified a generation of Americans, halted the construction of new nuclear plants for decades, and shifted the nation's energy policy towards fossil fuels for the next 40 years. If that valve had simply snapped shut as it was designed to, or if a single light on a dashboard had been wired to show the valve's actual position, the history of green energy in America might look completely different today. We might have lived in a world with significantly lower carbon emissions and a totally different geopolitical relationship with oil-producing nations. From a dropped cigar in a Maryland field to a stuck valve in a Pennsylvania power plant, history is not a solid wall of inevitable events. It is a fragile web of small errors. These moments remind us that the world is often held together by the smallest of threads, and that the next small error to change the world might be happening right now in a lab, a car, or a computer code, just waiting for the next chapter of history to be written.
We've seen how physical errors, dropped papers, wrong turns, and stuck valves can reshape history. But as we entered the digital age, the small error evolved. It migrated from the physical world into the lines of code and the flicker of computer screens. In the modern era, you don't need a grenade or a nuclear meltdown to cause global chaos. Sometimes all it takes is a single tired finger hitting the wrong key. This is the story of the fat finger trade, a moment when a simple typo nearly deleted billions of dollars from the global economy in the blink of an eye. The year was 2005. The setting wasn't a battlefield, but the high-intensity trading floor of Mizuho Securities in Japan. A young trader was tasked with selling shares of a recruitment company called JCOM Company. The order was simple: sell one share for 610,000 yen, about $5,000 at the time. It was a routine transaction. But in the frantic environment of a live market, the trader's brain and fingers disconnected. Instead of typing one share for 610,000 yen, he accidentally reversed the numbers. He entered an order to sell 610,000 shares for 1 yen each. In a split second, the trader had offered to sell more shares than actually existed in the entire company, and at a price that was practically free. The moment he hit enter, the market's automated algorithms sensed an unbelievable bargain. They pounced. Within seconds, the stock price of JCOM went into a vertical freefall. But the ripples didn't stop there. Because Mizuho Securities was such a massive player, other traders and automated bots across the Tokyo Stock Exchange began to panic. They assumed a major financial institution was collapsing or that a massive secret scandal had been uncovered. The fat finger error triggered a localized flash crash. The Tokyo Stock Exchange's benchmark index plummeted, and the exchange's computer systems began to buckle under the sheer volume of frantic sell orders. Mizuho realized the mistake almost immediately and tried to cancel the order 3 times. Each time, the exchange's computer system, hampered by its own technical glitches, refused to let them retract the trade. It was a digital nightmare, a massive financial leak that couldn't be plugged. By the time the dust settled at the end of the day, Mizuho Securities had lost over $340 million on a single keystroke. The error was so significant that it led to the resignation of the head of the Tokyo Stock Exchange and forced global financial markets to implement circuit breakers, automated kill switches that freeze trading if a stock drops too fast. This one typo fundamentally changed how global finance operates, shifting power away from human traders and toward the very algorithms that had exacerbated the panic. This event was a harbinger of the world we live in now,
a world where our entire civilization is layered on top of digital infrastructure. It proved that a single person sitting in a quiet office with a cup of coffee could accidentally trigger a global financial heart attack. The small error had become invisible, moving at the speed of light. But as we look toward the final frontier of our story, we see that the most dangerous errors aren't just about money or war. Sometimes they are about how we perceive the very world around us. We often think of mistakes as physical actions, a dropped map or a wrong turn, but the most devastating errors can be purely linguistic. In the summer of 1945, the world stood at a terrifying crossroads. World War II in Europe was over, but the Pacific theater remained a bloody stalemate. The United States had just successfully tested the atomic bomb, a weapon of such soul-crushing power that its creators feared it. On July 26th, the Allied leaders issued the Potsdam Declaration, an ultimatum demanding the unconditional surrender of Japan. The alternative, the document warned, was prompt and utter destruction. The fate of millions of people now rested on a single translation. In Tokyo, Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki and his cabinet met to discuss the ultimatum. The Japanese government wasn't ready to surrender immediately, but they weren't exactly rejecting it either. They wanted more time to negotiate and see if the Soviet Union would mediate. When the Japanese press cornered Prime Minister Suzuki for a statement, he used the word mokusatsu. It was a nuanced choice, a word derived from the Japanese characters for silence and kill. To Suzuki, he intended to convey something like no comment or we are maintaining a policy of silent reserve while we deliberate. However, when the word reached the ears of the Allied translators and the desk of U.S. President Harry Truman, it was interpreted through a much harsher lens. The translators rendered mokusatsu as to ignore with contempt or to treat with silent scorn. In the ears of the Americans, it sounded like the Japanese government had laughed at the ultimatum and thrown it back in their faces. There was no room for nuance in the middle of a world war. The Americans believed the Japanese were stubbornly choosing a fight to the finish. Because of the perceived arrogance of that one word, the gears of the Manhattan Project shifted into their final, lethal position. President Truman gave the order. Just 10 days after the mokusatsu comment, the Enola Gay took off for Hiroshima. The resulting atomic blast and the subsequent bombing of Nagasaki claimed the lives of over 200,000 people, mostly civilians, and ushered in the terrifying reality of the nuclear age. Historians and linguists have debated for decades if Suzuki had chosen a clearer, less ambiguous word. Could the atomic bombings have been avoided? If the translators had offered a more cautious interpretation, would the U.S. have waited just a few more weeks? We will never know for sure, but the tragedy of Hiroshima serves as the ultimate reminder that language is a minefield. A single mistranslated word can be as destructive as a 1,000-pound bomb. This brings our journey through history's small errors full circle. From the cigar fields of Maryland to the mistranslated halls of Tokyo, we see that the grand narrative of humanity is not written in stone by giants. It is a fragile, chaotic story written in pencil by ordinary people who get tired, get confused, and make mistakes. We live in a world shaped by the survivors of these errors, and we are only ever one small mistake away from the next world-changing event.
As we move into the early 20th century, we find that some errors don't just kill or save, they fundamentally change the chemical makeup of our world. This is the story of a mistake that happened in a French laboratory in 1912, a mistake involving a simple chemistry experiment that went wrong, leading to a discovery that touches your life every single day. If you have ever enjoyed the crust of a loaf of bread, the sear on a steak, or the golden brown hue of a toasted marshmallow, you are witnessing the result of the Maillard reaction. But for its discoverer, Louis Camille Maillard, it was initially seen as a failure of his original intent. Maillard was a physician and chemist trying to solve a very specific medical mystery: how do cells synthesize proteins? He was mixing amino acids and sugars in a test tube, hoping to see them link together to form complex, life-giving proteins. Instead of the clear, elegant solution he expected, the mixture turned a muddy, dark brown. By the standards of his specific goal, the experiment was a mess. He hadn't created a protein, he had created a burnt sludge. To many scientists of the era, this would have been a discard and start over moment. However, Maillard paused. He realized that this error, the browning of the mixture, wasn't just dirt. It was a complex chemical reaction where the sugars and amino acids were transforming into hundreds of different flavor compounds. He had accidentally mapped the chemistry of deliciousness. For centuries, humans had been cooking with fire, but no one understood why heat made food taste better. Because Maillard followed a mistake in his protein research, he unlocked the secret of the culinary world. But the ripple effect of this brown sludge goes far beyond the kitchen. The Maillard reaction is now a cornerstone of modern food science, allowing for the creation of everything from coffee and chocolate to the specific flavor profiles of plant-based meats. Without this error, our understanding of food preservation and nutrition would be decades behind. More importantly, this same reaction happens inside the human body. It's linked to aging and the complications of diabetes. What started as a messy test tube in 1912 became a primary lens through which we view both our health and our dinner. Imagine if Maillard had been more precise, or if he had cleaned his equipment more thoroughly. We might still be treating cooking as a magical mystery rather than a predictable science. This small error of producing a brown mess instead of a protein chain changed how billions of people experience one of the most basic human needs: eating. It proves that sometimes the wrong result in a lab is actually the right answer for humanity's palate. As we look toward our final chapter, we will shift from the chemistry of food to the chemistry of the atmosphere, where a single man's brilliant invention turned out to be the most persistent small error in the history of the environment, a mistake that stayed hidden in the air for decades. In the 1920s, a brilliant American engineer named Thomas Midgley Jr. was tasked with solving two of the biggest technical headaches of the industrial age. He succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. But in doing so, he committed a small error in judgment that would lead to a global environmental catastrophe. Midgley didn't set out to poison the world. He was a problem solver who simply failed to look at the hidden side of his solutions. He is often cited as the man who had more impact on the atmosphere than any other single organism in Earth's history. Midgley's first success was solving engine knock, a violent vibration in early car engines that limited their power. He discovered that adding tetraethyl lead to gasoline made engines run as smooth as silk. The error wasn't in the engineering, it was in the total disregard for the known toxicity of lead. Despite seeing his own workers collapse and die from lead poisoning, Midgley held a press conference where he washed his hands in the leaded fuel and breathed in the fumes for 60 seconds to prove it was safe. It wasn't. For the next 5 decades, leaded gasoline pumped millions of tons of neurotoxins into the air, lowering the IQ of entire generations and causing untold health crises across the United States and the world. But Midgley wasn't done. His next task was to find a safe, non-flammable refrigerant for home appliances. At the time, refrigerants used dangerous gases that could leak and kill families in their sleep. Midgley invented chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, specifically Freon. It was a miracle of chemistry, stable, non-toxic to humans, and incredibly efficient. He was hailed as a hero. The small error here was a lack of foresight. Because CFCs were so chemically stable, they didn't break down in the lower atmosphere.
Instead, they drifted up into the stratosphere, where they began a slow, invisible war against the ozone layer, the planet's only shield from deadly ultraviolet radiation. For decades, the world celebrated Midgley's inventions as the peak of human progress. It wasn't until the 1970s and 80s that scientists realized the miracle gas was burning a hole in the sky. If the error hadn't been caught and the Montreal Protocol hadn't banned CFCs, the Earth's surface would have eventually become uninhabitable. Midgley's legacy is a haunting reminder that a small error in assessing long-term consequences can outweigh the most brilliant short-term gains. He solved the problems of the 1920s by accidentally mortgaging the future of the planet. Midgley's own end was a final tragic irony of his own making. Stricken with polio and unable to move, he used his engineering skills to build an elaborate system of pulleys and ropes to help him get out of bed. One morning, he became entangled in the ropes of his own invention and was strangled to death. The man who had been trapped by the unintended consequences of his global inventions was ultimately killed by the unintended consequences of his personal one.
As we move into the heart of the 20th century, we find that some errors are born from the sheer exhaustion of men trying to hold back the tide of revolution. In 1989, the world was held in the icy grip of the Cold War. The Berlin Wall stood as the ultimate symbol of oppression, a concrete scar across Europe that looked like it would last for centuries. The East German government was under immense pressure to reform, and they decided to ease travel restrictions slightly, a controlled safety valve to prevent a full-scale uprising. However, they forgot one thing: to tell the man speaking to the world exactly what the plan was. On the evening of November 9, 1980, Günter Schabowski, an East German official, stepped up to a podium for a live, televised press conference. He had been handed a piece of paper right before he walked on stage, a document detailing new, temporary travel regulations. The plan was for citizens to apply for visas through a lengthy process starting the following day, but Schabowski hadn't had time to read the notes thoroughly. When a journalist asked, "When does this go into effect?" Schabowski hesitated, shuffled his papers, and uttered the small error that changed the world. "As far as I know, it takes effect immediately, without delay." The effect was instantaneous. Thousands of East Berliners watching the broadcast live dropped what they were doing and rushed to the border crossings. They didn't have visas, they only had Schabowski's words. At the Bornholmer Strasse crossing, the border guards were baffled. They had received no orders to open the gates. They were staring at a growing, shouting mass of humanity. The guards called their superiors, but no one wanted to give the order to fire on the crowd, and no one knew how to fix Schabowski's mistake. Under the weight of a single sentence spoken in error, the guards finally stepped aside. They opened the gates. The small error of a tired official had created a physical reality that the government could no longer control. People from the east and west began to embrace atop the wall, chipping away at the concrete with hammers and picks. By the time the East German leadership realized what had happened, the wall, and the iron curtain it represented, was effectively dead. Within a year, Germany was reunified, and the Soviet Union began its final collapse. If Schabowski had simply said, "Applications start tomorrow at 9 a.m., the authorities would have had time to set up checkpoints and maintain control. The Cold War might have dragged on for another decade, potentially ending in a far more violent confrontation. Instead, a mistake in timing led to the most peaceful revolution in modern history. It shows that even the most rigid, totalitarian systems can be toppled by a single accidental truth told at the wrong time. As we look toward the next chapter, we move from the political stage to the very code that runs our modern life. We will explore the year 2000 bug, an error that didn't happen, but the fear of which changed how we build the future. In the early days of computing, digital memory was more expensive than gold. To save precious space, the pioneering programmers of the 1960s and 70s made a small logical choice. They decided to represent years using only the last two digits. 1965 became simply 65. It was an elegant, common-sense shortcut at a time when a computer with the power of a modern toaster took up an entire room. No one imagined that the software they were writing would still be the backbone of global infrastructure 30 years later. This tiny efficiency was a ticking bomb buried in the world's code. As the 1990s roared toward a close, a terrifying realization dawned on the tech world. When the clock struck midnight on January 1st, 2000, computers across the globe wouldn't see 00 as the year 2000. They would interpret it as 1900. To a bank's interest calculator, a person born in 1995 would suddenly be negative 95 years old. To a power grid or a nuclear silo, the date-based maintenance schedules might glitch, causing systems to shut down, or worse, malfunction in ways no one could predict. This was the year 2000 bug, a global small error that had been copy-pasted into millions of lines of code for decades. The fear was absolute. Headlines predicted planes falling from the sky, equipment failing in hospitals, and the total collapse of the global financial system. To prevent this digital apocalypse, governments and corporations spent an estimated $300 billion to $600 billion in a frantic worldwide race against time. Armies of programmers were pulled out of retirement to sift through ancient COBOL code line by line, manually expanding 99 to 1999 and 00 to 2000. It was the largest coordinated technical effort in human history, all to fix a mistake that was only 2 characters long. When the ball dropped in Times Square on January 1st, 2000, nothing happened. The lights stayed on, the banks stayed open, and the world didn't end. Because of this lack of disaster, many people today look back at year 2000 as a hoax or a mass hallucination. But the truth is more sobering. The disaster didn't happen because the small error was caught just in time. The $600 billion was the price of a global insurance policy against our own short-sightedness. It was a massive wake-up call that proved how deeply we had woven flawed technology into the fabric of our survival. The legacy of the year 2000 bug changed the way we build everything. It birthed the modern cybersecurity and IT auditing industries. It forced companies to map out their digital dependencies for the first time. But more importantly, it taught us that a small shortcut taken today can become a monumental crisis for the next generation. We are currently living in the post-year 2000 world, where every piece of software we rely on is likely hiding a similar small error that we simply haven't discovered yet. As we conclude this chapter, we realize that the errors of the past, from the battlefields of the Civil War to the server rooms of the 90s, all share a common thread. They are moments where human nature collided with a complex system. Whether it's a misplaced cigar or a missing digit, history is a reminder that we are never as in control as we think we are.
We often think of history changing because of what did happen, but sometimes the world is reshaped by what didn't happen. In the late 1700s, the coastline of California was the ultimate prize for European empires. The Spanish, the British, and the Russians were all scouring the Pacific coast, looking for a legendary great harbor that could serve as a naval fortress to control the New World. For over 200 years, dozens of the world's most skilled explorers, including the legendary Sir Francis Drake, sailed right past the entrance to San Francisco Bay. They missed the most strategic harbor on the planet because of a small error of timing and a trick of the weather. The entrance to San Francisco Bay, now famously spanned by the Golden Gate Bridge, is a narrow strait shrouded in a thick, persistent blanket of fog. Because of the way the cold Pacific air hits the warm California coast, the gate is often invisible from a mile out at sea. Explorer after explorer missed it, recording the coastline as a continuous wall of cliffs. But the real error occurred in 1769, when a Spanish land expedition led by Gaspar de Portola was actually looking for something else, Monterey Bay. Portola and his men were exhausted, starving and suffering from scurvy. They had a map of Monterey Bay, but they overshot it. They were so blinded by their own misery and their fixed focus on finding Monterey that when they climbed the Sweeney Ridge and looked down upon the massive, shimmering expanse of San Francisco Bay, they didn't realize they had found the greatest harbor in the world. They saw it as an annoying obstacle that was blocking their path. They turned around and headed back, recording it as a mere lagoon. Because of this failure to recognize the magnitude of the discovery, the Spanish didn't settle San Francisco for another 7 years. That small delay changed the geopolitical map of the Americas. Had the Spanish fortified the Golden Gate in the 1500s or 1600s, it would have become an impregnable fortress, likely preventing the later expansion of the United States to the Pacific. San Francisco might have remained a Spanish, then Mexican stronghold, creating a massive sovereign Latin American power on the West Coast. Instead, the bay remained a sleepy, sparsely populated outpost until the mid-1800s. This discovery delay meant that when gold was finally found at Sutter's Mill in 1848, the territory was newly under American control. The resulting gold rush transformed a tiny village into a global metropolis almost overnight, fueling the industrialization of the United States and funding the Union in the Civil War. The entire American century was built on the back of California's wealth that would have belonged to the Spanish crown if a few explorers hadn't been tricked by a bit of fog and a bad map. It's a haunting thought. The borders of modern nations and the flow of global wealth were decided by a low-hanging cloud. It reminds us that sometimes the error isn't a wrong action, but a failure of perception. We often sail right past our greatest opportunities because we are too focused on the Monterey we were told to find. Sometimes a world-changing error doesn't happen in a war room or a high-tech laboratory. It happens in a cramped, oily shipyard. In 1943, at the height of World War II, a mechanical engineer named Richard James was working in a Philadelphia naval shipyard. His mission was high stakes. He was trying to develop a system of specialized springs that could support and stabilize sensitive instruments on board Navy ships. In the chaotic environment of a ship tossed by waves, these instruments often broke, and the military needed a way to suspend them in a state of perfect balance. James was experimenting with hundreds of different steel wires, winding them into various tensions and lengths. One afternoon, he reached for a spare coil of wire on a high shelf. His hand slipped. The coil didn't just fall to the floor with a thud, it walked. The error of his clumsy grip caused the spring to somersault from the shelf, land on a stack of books, then step down to a table, and finally coil itself neatly on the floor. James stood there frozen. To any other engineer, this was a failure, a ruined prototype that had literally run away from him. But James saw something else. He saw a physics miracle in motion. He went home that night and told his wife, "I think I can make a toy out of this." That small error of a dropped spring became the Slinky. The impact of this mistake was far more than just child play. When the Slinky debuted at Gimbel's department store in 1945, the first 400 units sold out in 90 minutes. Since then, over 300 million Slinkies have been sold worldwide. But the true world-changing aspect lies in the science it inspired. The Slinky became one of the most important tools in American classrooms for demonstrating the physics of longitudinal waves. It helped a generation of students, the same students who would go on to work for NASA and in telecommunications, visualize how sound and light travel through space. During the Vietnam War, the Slinky even found its way back to the military. Soldiers realized that the toy was actually a perfect, portable, and expandable antenna. They would throw one end over a tree branch to extend their radio range in the dense jungle, saving lives through better communication. All of this, the multi-billion-dollar industry, the educational breakthroughs, and the makeshift military tech, originated from a single moment of Butterfingers in a shipyard.
If Richard James had caught that spring before it hit the ground, he might have spent the rest of his life as an anonymous engineer working on naval stabilization. Instead, his mistake created a cultural icon and a scientific tool that bridged the gap between play and physics. It serves as a lighthearted but profound reminder. Your failures are often just discoveries waiting for a change in perspective. As we move toward the final chapters of our saga, we will see that even the most terrifying errors in history can lead to a world that is safer, more connected, and more aware of its own fragility.
In the digital age, we have outsourced our sense of reality to the screens in our pockets. We trust our GPS and our digital maps with an almost religious fervor. But in 2010, a small error in a line of code at Google headquarters proved that a mistake in the virtual world can have terrifying, real-world consequences. This is the story of how a mapping glitch nearly triggered a war between two Central American nations, Nicaragua and Costa Rica. For over a century, the border between these two countries along the San Juan River had been a point of contention, but it was largely managed through treaties and international law. However, in late 2010, Nicaraguan troops crossed the border into an area known as Isla Calero, territory that Costa Rica had long claimed as its own. When Costa Rican officials demanded an explanation, the Nicaraguan commander, Eden Pastora, gave a shocking defense. He wasn't relying on ancient scrolls or military intelligence. He pointed to Google Maps. Due to a technical error in Google's database, the borderline had been shifted roughly 2.7 kilometers, about 1.7 miles, into Costa Rican territory. To the software, that forest was Nicaragua. To the soldiers on the ground, the software was the truth. Relying on this digital hallucination, Nicaraguan troops set up camp, took down Costa Rican flags, and began dredging the river, causing significant environmental damage. The situation spiraled into a high-stakes international crisis. Costa Rica, a nation famously without a standing army, appealed to the Organization of American States and the UN Security Council. For a few tense weeks, the threat of a violent border skirmish loomed over the region. People were ready to fight and die over a mistake made by a programmer in Mountain View, California, who likely had no idea where the San Juan River even was. Google eventually admitted to the error, citing a source data mistake from the U.S. State Department. They corrected the map, but the diplomatic scars remained for years. This incident revealed a chilling new reality. In the 21st century, the small error has been digitized. We no longer need to drop a cigar wrapper or take a wrong turn in a car to change history. We just need to misplace a few pixels on a global interface. It showed that the map is no longer just a representation of the world. In many ways, it has become the world. This Google Maps war serves as a final modern warning. As we move faster into a world governed by algorithms and AI, our dependency on these systems means that a single bug, a skewed data set, or a mistyped coordinate can move borders, crash markets, or incite violence before a human even has time to double-check the facts. Our ancestors' mistakes were limited by the speed of a horse or a ship. Our mistakes travel at the speed of light. As we look deeper into the history of human error, we find that sometimes a disaster is caused not by a lack of technology, but by a small error in how we handle the technology we already have. In 1893, the British Royal Navy was the undisputed master of the oceans, a floating empire of steel and steam. Their flagship in the Mediterranean was the HMS Victoria, a massive, state-of-the-art battleship that was considered the pinnacle of Victorian engineering.
But on a clear, calm afternoon off the coast of Tripoli, this entire symbol of British pride was sent to the bottom of the sea because of a single nonsensical command and the error of blind obedience. Vice Admiral George Tryon was a brilliant but notoriously difficult commander who loved complex naval maneuvers. He wanted to show off the precision of his fleet by ordering 2 parallel columns of massive battleships to perform a simultaneous 180-degree turn inward toward each other. The goal was for the 2 lines to end up sailing in the opposite direction, side by side. It was a beautiful, choreographed dance of iron giants. However, Tryon made a small but fatal calculation error. He ordered the 2 columns, which were only 1,200 yards apart, to turn inward, but the turning circle of these massive ships was significantly wider than that. Mathematically, it was impossible. The ships were guaranteed to collide in the middle of the turn. When Tryon's subordinate, Rear Admiral Markham, saw the signal, he hesitated. He knew the math didn't add up. He signaled back a question, sensing the impending doom. But Tryon, annoyed by the questioning of his authority, signaled back a sharp, sarcastic rebuke. "What are you waiting for?" This was the small error of ego. Faced with a direct order from a superior, Markham succumbed to the rigid naval culture of the time. He ignored his own eyes and his own logic. He ordered his ship, the Camperdown, to begin the turn. The result was a slow-motion horror. The 2 massive ships curved toward each other, their iron prows cutting through the water like knives. On the decks, sailors watched in stunned silence as the Camperdown slammed into the side of the Victoria. Because the Victoria was top-heavy with massive guns, it didn't just take on water, it capsized and sank in less than 15 minutes. Admiral Tryon went down with his ship, his last recorded words being, "It is all my fault." This small error claimed the lives of 358 sailors and cost the British Empire its most expensive asset. But the ripple effect was even larger. The disaster forced the Royal Navy to completely rethink its command structure. It ended the era of blind obedience and led to the development of the modern initiative system, where officers are encouraged to question orders that are clearly suicidal or mathematically flawed. This shift in military philosophy proved vital during the chaos of World War I, where individual initiative often saved fleets from destruction. The sinking of the Victoria serves as a chilling reminder. The most sophisticated machines in the world are still at the mercy of the human ego. A single small error in a calculation, backed by a refusal to admit a mistake, can sink an empire just as easily as any enemy fleet.
In the world of chemistry, safety first is a mantra that every student learns on day 1. You never eat in the lab, you never taste your experiments, and you always wash your hands before leaving. But in 1879, at Johns Hopkins University, a young Russian chemist named Konstantin Fahlberg committed a small error in hygiene that would change the global food industry forever. He was working in the laboratory of Professor Ira Remsen, trying to discover new uses for coal tar derivatives. It was grueling, messy, and chemically dirty work. Late one evening, Fahlberg became so engrossed in his research that he forgot the time. Realizing he was late for dinner, he rushed out of the lab without washing his hands. When he sat down at his dinner table and broke a piece of bread, he noticed something bizarre. The bread tasted incredibly sweet, almost sickeningly sweet. He tasted his fingers, then his thumb. Everything he touched turned into sugar. For a moment, he feared he had accidentally poisoned himself with a toxic chemical. Most people would have panicked and called a doctor. Fahlberg, driven by scientific curiosity, did something even more reckless. He ran back to the lab.
He began tasting everything on his workbench, every beaker, every vial, and every evaporating dish he'd had used that day. Finally, he found the source, a beaker containing the reaction of orthosulfobenzoic acid with phosphorus chloride and ammonia. He had accidentally synthesized saccharin, the world's first artificial sweetener. This small error in laboratory safety created a substance that was roughly 300 to 400 times sweeter than cane sugar, but had 0 calories. At the time, sugar was an expensive luxury, and diabetes was a poorly understood, often fatal condition. Fahlberg's dirty hands provided a solution no one knew they were looking for. He quickly patented the process and began mass-producing saccharin, becoming incredibly wealthy in the process, much to the annoyance of his professor, who felt the discovery belonged to the university. The ripple effect of this mistake was massive. Saccharin became a staple during World War I and World War II, when sugar was strictly rationed. It birthed the modern diet industry, paving the way for everything from Tab soda to the thousands of sugar-free products filling grocery store shelves today. It changed our global relationship with calories and shifted the economics of the sugar trade. Had Fahlberg been a more careful student, had he scrubbed his hands for 20 seconds before heading home, the miracle of 0-calorie sweetness might have remained buried in a coal tar waste bin for another century. It is a sugary irony that one of the most health-conscious products in history was born from a complete lack of basic hygiene. But as we look toward our next chapter, we move from the sweetness of a lab to the cold, hard steel of the industrial age, where a single missing bolt on a bridge led to one of the most terrifying engineering disasters caught on film. In 1940, the state of Washington celebrated the opening of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, the third longest suspension bridge in the world. It was a marvel of aesthetic beauty, slender, elegant, and shimmering like a silver ribbon across the water. But this beauty hid a small error in aerodynamic judgment that would soon make the bridge the most famous engineering failure in history. While the engineers had accounted for the weight of the cars and the strength of the steel, they had overlooked a simple principle of physics: the wind. The error lay in the design of the bridge's girders. Unlike other bridges of the era that used open truss designs, which allowed wind to pass through, the Tacoma Narrows used solid plate girders. These acted like a giant sail. Even a moderate breeze didn't just push against the bridge, it created a phenomenon called aeroelastic fluttering. From the very first week, construction workers noticed the bridge began to bounce and sway in the wind. They nicknamed it Galloping Gertie. For 4 months, Galloping Gertie became a local amusement. People would drive from miles away just to experience the thrill of a bridge that felt like a roller coaster. Engineers, however, were worried. They installed various stabilization devices, but they were treating the symptoms, not the small error of the original design. On the morning of November 7, 1940, the wind hit a steady 42 miles per hour, not a hurricane, just a brisk autumn day, but it was the perfect frequency to trigger a torsional vibration. The bridge didn't just bounce, it began to twist. The concrete roadway tilted at 45-degree angles, one side rising as the other fell. A reporter named Leonard Coatsworth was trapped on the bridge in his car. He crawled to safety on his hands and knees, clutching the curb as the world around him turned into a wild, undulating ribbon of steel. His car and his poor dog Tubby inside it remained on the deck. After hours of twisting, the steel finally reached its breaking point. With a roar that sounded like 1,000 gunshots, the main span snapped and plunged into the frigid waters below. The small error of choosing solid plates over open trusses caused a $6 million structure to tear itself apart. But the ripple effect of this disaster was revolutionary. It completely ended the era of guesswork in bridge aerodynamics. The terrifying footage of the bridge twisting like a piece of rubber became the most important educational film in history for civil engineers. Every bridge built since, including the massive Verrazano Narrows and the Golden Gate, has been wind tunnel tested and designed specifically to avoid the fate of Galloping Gertie. If the designers had added just a few more inches of ventilation or used a slightly different girder, the bridge would have survived, but we might never have truly understood the invisible power of wind on our infrastructure. The disaster at Tacoma ensured that the thousands of bridges we drive across today are safe. It was a failure that taught the world how to stay grounded.
In the 1950s, the Cold War was a game of high-stakes shadows. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a race for nuclear superiority, but there was a massive problem. Neither side knew exactly what the other was doing. The Americans were terrified of a bomber gap, a theory that the Soviets had thousands more long-range nuclear planes than the U.S. This fear was driving the world toward a preemptive strike. To solve this, the CIA developed the U-2 spy plane, a jet that flew so high at the very edge of space that it was thought to be invisible and untouchable. The U-2 was a masterpiece of secrecy. It carried cameras that could take crystal-clear photos of a golf ball from 70,000 feet. But the small error that changed the Cold War wasn't a mechanical failure. It was a simple human oversight in the darkroom. In 1956, during one of the first secret flights over the Soviet Union, a technician was developing the film. The photos showed vast stretches of Soviet territory, but on one particular frame, there was a tiny blurry streak, a small error in the film's emotion, or perhaps a speck of dust on the lens. To a tired eye, that streak was trash, but a high-level photo interpreter noticed something. By measuring the length and angle of a tiny shadow cast by a structure on the ground, he realized the bomber gap was a total myth. The streak on the film, when cross-referenced with other frames, proved that the Soviets were actually struggling to build their fleet. They had dozens of planes, not thousands. The U.S. military-industrial complex had been bracing for a ghost. This discovery changed everything. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, armed with the truth from a single roll of film, was able to resist the massive pressure from war hawks in Washington to ramp up nuclear production or launch a surprise attack. This small error in Soviet secrecy, allowing their real numbers to be caught on camera, prevented a multi-billion-dollar arms race from turning into a hot nuclear war. The U-2 flights continued, providing a stabilizing transparency that kept the world from the brink for years. However, the small error had a darker side. In 1960, a U-2 pilot named Francis Gary Powers was shot down over Russia. The U.S. government, assuming the pilot had died and the plane was destroyed, issued a cover story claiming it was a weather plane that had lost its way. This was the small error of overconfidence. They didn't realize that the Soviets had recovered the plane almost intact and captured the pilot alive. When Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev revealed the living pilot on international television, it blew the lid off the secret. The Paris summit collapsed, the Cold War intensified, and the trust between the two superpowers evaporated for a decade. A single roll of film saved the world from a nuclear strike, but a single lie about that film nearly started another one. It shows that in the world of espionage, the smallest detail, a shadow on a photograph, or a lie in a press release, can be the difference between peace and total annihilation. As we reach the final chapter of our journey, we step away from the brink of nuclear war and into the quiet warmth of a California greenhouse in the early 1900s. We often assume that the symbols of our culture, the things we see every year without fail, were designed with grand intent.
But the most iconic symbol of the holiday season, the poinsettia, became a global phenomenon because of a small error in a family's farming strategy and a biological quirk that no one initially understood. In the wild hills of Mexico, the Euphorbia pulcherrima was a lanky, weed-like shrub that most people ignored. It wasn't a flower. Those bright red petals are actually just modified leaves called bracts. In 1828, Joel Roberts Poinsett, the first U.S. minister to Mexico, sent some samples back to South Carolina. For decades, it remained a botanical curiosity, a small plant that was difficult to grow and even harder to keep alive in the cold northern winters. The error occurred with the Ecke family in Hollywood, California. Albert Ecke and his son Paul Ecke were trying to build a business selling cut flowers. They were struggling to find a signature product. One year, due to a timing mistake in their planting schedule and an unusually warm autumn, a batch of their Mexican shrubs failed to grow into tall, woody bushes they expected. Instead, they stayed short, compact, and incredibly dense with vibrant red leaves right as December approached. Paul Ecke realized this stunted growth wasn't a failure, it was a gold mine. He realized by a small error of nature and cultivation, he had a plant that looked like a living Christmas decoration. But he didn't just sell the plants, he used a secret grafting technique, essentially a controlled error in the plant's DNA, to ensure the plants stayed bushy and bright. To keep the monopoly, he told no one how it was done. Then he began the most brilliant marketing error in history. He sent free poinsettias to television studios for their holiday specials. He made sure that whenever Americans looked at a Christmas set on The Tonight Show or The Ed Sullivan Show, they saw his red plants in the background. Because of a misplaced shipment of weeds and a lucky break in the weather, the poinsettia became the best-selling potted plant in the world. Today, it's a $250 million industry in the U.S. alone. The small error here was the assumption that a plant had to be a traditional flower to be valuable. By embracing the weird, stunted, red-leaved weed, the Eckes changed the visual language of winter forever. If those first plants had grown correctly, tall and spindly, they would have been thrown in the trash, and our homes would look very different every December.